In 1590, starving Parisians dug up their ancestors and ground their skeletons into a lethal flour substitute. This is the story of the bone bread and the summer the city ate its dead. Cinema usually paints a heroic picture of sieges, with noble knights enduring hunger on the battlements. The reality of 1590 Paris was a grotesque nightmare where human sanity simply evaporated. As the wealthy elite hoarded the last of the grain, the starving commoners didn't just tighten their belts. They turned the city's ancient graveyards into a macabre bakery, crafting a meal that literally tore their bodies apart from the inside out. To understand how a civilized city descends into this level of desperation, you have to look at the trap that snapped shut around Paris in May of 1590. King Henri III had been assassinated, leaving the Protestant Henri of Navarre as the heir to the French throne. The Catholic League, which controlled Paris, flatly refused to bow to a heretic king. In response, Henri brought his army to the gates and systematically dismantled the city's ability to survive. His forces torched every single windmill in the Parisian countryside. Standing on the city walls, citizens watched the night sky glow a sickly orange as the machines meant to mill their daily bread burned to the ground. Within weeks, the wheat reserves vanished. The air, usually thick with the scent of fresh baking, turned sour and stagnant. Market stalls sat empty and bakeries shuttered their doors. For the tens of thousands trapped inside, the realization was immediate and terrifying. No food was coming, and there was no way out. The countdown to mass starvation had begun, and the only full pantries belonged to the elite who started the war. By the time the sweltering heat of summer arrived, the hunger had transformed Paris into a surreal nightmare. With the grain gone, the citizens turned their eyes to the animals. First went the horses and mules, slaughtered in the streets to feed the masses. When that meat vanished, the population began hunting down the city's pets. Dogs and cats were chased through narrow, twisting alleyways and thrown into cooking pots. Eventually, the streets became deafeningly silent. No dogs barked, and no birds remained in the squares. People were reduced to ripping up grass in public parks and boiling scraps of old leather just to have something to chew on. If you are fascinated by these dark, untold corners of history, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss an episode. The reality of 1590 was a creeping madness. Stomachs were distended, teeth fell out from scurvy, and people died in the gutters by the thousands. The Catholic League's leadership insisted that God was testing their faith against the Protestant king. But theology offers very little comfort when you are watching your children starve to death. A modern metropolis like New York or London would collapse in days if cut off from the outside world. No grocery deliveries, no trucks on the highway, and no water in the pipes. Within 3 days, the shelves would be bare. Within a week, society would fracture. Now consider enduring that exact scenario for months, with zero hope of relief. That was the grim reality for Parisians by August. The death toll skyrocketed, eventually reaching nearly 50,000 people. Corpses piled up faster than they could be buried, and the stench of decay hung heavy over the city, mingling with the oppressive summer heat. It was in this apocalyptic environment, where the boundary between the living and the dead was already blurring, that someone looked at the overflowing mass graves and had a terrifying realization. If there was no wheat left in the fields, perhaps they could harvest the only resource the city still had in abundance. The ground was packed with bones. Skeletons of ancestors, long buried and forgotten, were about to be forcefully drafted into a horrifying culinary experiment to keep the living breathing for just one more day. Most historians gloss over the fact that this wasn't just a frenzied mob hacking at the dirt. This was a deliberate, organized, and almost industrial process. desperate citizens systematically excavated the mass graves at the Holy Innocents Cemetery, the oldest and largest burial ground in Paris. They weren't looking for fresh corpses. They were specifically targeting the old, brittle bones of generations past. They hauled these human remains out of the earth, cleaned off the dirt, and brought them to the few surviving stone mortars in the city. There they ground the skulls and femurs of their own ancestors into a fine, pale gray powder. This bone dust was mixed with polluted water to form a crude, chalky dough. They baked it in ovens just like standard flour, creating small, dense loaves that looked, at first glance, like normal bread. It is entirely possible that starving peasants were literally eating the remains of their own grandfathers. The psychological toll of a meal forged from human remains is impossible to calculate. But when the alternative is watching your family wither away, the survival instinct overrides every cultural taboo. The burden of this horrific diet fell hardest on the most vulnerable members of society. While the wealthy Catholic elites and the high-ranking clergy still had secret caches of salted meats and fine wine tucked away in their vast, cool cellars, the poor mothers of Paris were left with nothing. They were the ones forced to feed chalky, gray bone bread to their crying children. It is a haunting thought to realize that a mother in 1590 knew the ashen lump she handed to her child was made from human remains. But the tragedy did not end with the psychological trauma. Biologically, human bones offer absolutely zero nutritional value to the living. Worse still, the bone dust acted like microscopic shards of glass. When the children swallowed this fake bread, the sharp, indigestible fragments of bone powder tore through their delicate digestive tracts. It caused agonizing stomach cramps, severe internal bleeding, and violent bowel obstructions. The very food that these desperate mothers thought would save their families ended up killing them faster and in far more excruciating pain than pure starvation ever would have. The streets echoed with the cries of children clutching their swollen bellies, dying in agony because the only food available was literally shredding their intestines from the inside out. We actually know the exact, gruesome details of this phenomenon thanks to a man named Pierre L'Estoile. He was a meticulous diarist and a clerk for the Parisian Parliament, who recorded the daily horrors of the siege with a chilling, professional detachment. On August 25, 1590, L'Estoile officially documented the creation of this bone bread in his journal. He noted how it was being hawked in the streets to the starving masses, serving as a grim testament to the total collapse of the city. L'Estoile's accounts are incredibly rare primary sources that bring the nightmare of the 16th century directly into our modern world. He watched as his neighbors wasted away, noting who survived by eating boiled leather and who succumbed to the agonizing internal bleeding caused by the bone flour. If you find yourself drawn to these verified first-hand accounts from the darkest moments in human history, you should take a second to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a dive into the past. L'Estoile's writings reveal a city completely unmoored from reality, where the daily sight of carts hauling away hundreds of rigid, emaciated bodies became so commonplace that people simply stepped over the corpses on their way to the cemetery to dig up more bones. In a twist of pitch-black irony, the citizens of Paris actually gave this horrifying concoction a brand name. They sarcastically dubbed it Madame de Montpensier's bread. Catherine of Lorraine, the Duchess of Montpensier, was one of the most powerful and radical leaders of the Catholic League holding the city. She was an aristocratic hardliner, fiercely dedicated to keeping the Protestant King Henri out of Paris at any cost. When the bone bread was first invented, the Duchess actually promoted it with a straight face. She publicly praised the ingenuity of the poor, exalting this grave dust bread as a brilliant solution to the food crisis and a sign of God's providence. She encouraged the starving populace to eat it with pride, framing it as a patriotic sacrifice for their holy cause. But of course, there was a deeply cynical catch. As Pierre Lestoile dryly noted in his diary, Madame de Montpensier absolutely refused to let a single crumb of the bone bread pass her own lips. While the poor were destroying their internal organs for the cause, she and her aristocratic friends were safely dining on their hoarded rations. It is a darkly relatable political tale. The wealthy leaders at the top demanding ultimate sacrifice from the working class, while making sure they themselves never have to suffer the consequences. When the sun finally set over the besieged city, Paris transformed into a truly terrifying landscape. The streets were completely devoid of any artificial light because the oil and tallow had long since been eaten or burned. Under the cover of pitch-black darkness, grave robbing became a highly competitive and violent nocturnal industry. Shadowy figures would slip into the cemeteries with shovels and pickaxes, fighting each other over the oldest, driest bones, because fresh bones were too wet to grind into powder. It was a macabre underworld economy where a shattered human femur was suddenly worth more than gold. Criminal gangs began to form, specializing in the illicit trade of grave dirt and skeletal remains. There were even whispered rumors in the dark alleys that some of the bone bread being sold on the black market was not just made from ancient ancestors. Paranoia swept through the starving population as people began to suspect that the recently deceased, those who had just dropped dead from starvation that very morning, were being secretly dragged away in the night to be dried, ground up, and sold back to their surviving relatives by sunrise. The medical fallout from this desperate diet was absolutely catastrophic, but strangely enough, the idea of consuming human remains was not entirely foreign to 16th century medicine. During this era, wealthy Europeans frequently consumed a remedy known as mumia, which was literally powder scraped from imported Egyptian mummies. It was believed to cure everything from headaches to stomach ulcers. In the twisted logic of a starving, delirious society, eating human bone dust did not seem quite as alien as it does to us today. They genuinely believed that the life force of their ancestors might somehow transfer to them, granting them the strength to survive the siege. But the biological reality was brutally unforgiving. The human digestive system simply cannot process calcium phosphate in such massive, abrasive quantities. The bone bread absorbed all the moisture in the stomach, creating solid, rock-like blockages in the intestines. It caused severe impaction, leading to sepsis and agonizing death. The physicians of Paris, completely out of medicine and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the dying, could do absolutely nothing. They walked the wards helplessly, watching a superstitious medical gamble turn into a horrific, self-inflicted mass casualty event. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about human nature. What would you actually do if your city ran out of food tomorrow? We all like to think of ourselves as civilized, guided by strict moral compasses and unbreakable ethical boundaries. We sit in our comfortable, climate-controlled homes, ordering groceries from an app, completely convinced that we would never stoop to the barbaric desperation of 16th century peasants. But the terrifying truth of the 1590 siege is that the people who ground up their ancestors' bones were exactly like us. They were bakers, clerks, mothers and fathers, just trying to keep their families alive for one more sunset. The only difference between their society and ours is a fragile supply chain that relies on trucks arriving on time. If the supermarket shelves went empty for a month, how long would our modern morality really hold out? Would it take a week before we turned on each other? A month? Let me know down in the comments how long you think modern society would last before we resorted to unthinkable measures to survive. Because history shows us that the line between a civilized citizen and a desperate survivor is dangerously thin. There is one incredibly obscure detail about the end of this siege that often gets left out of the history books, and it reveals a shocking level of empathy from the very man who triggered the starvation in the first place. King Henri IV, the Protestant monarch who had ordered the windmills burned and the food supply cut off, was actually watching the horrors unfold from his military camp just outside the city walls. Through his network of spies, he received daily reports that smelled of desperation, accounts of bone bread, the sight of dying children, and the grim reality of 50,000 corpses piling up in the summer heat. Despite the fact that the Parisians were his sworn enemies who fiercely denied his right to the throne, the sheer inhumanity of the situation finally broke him. In an unprecedented military move, Henri secretly allowed his own soldiers to smuggle bread and supplies over the walls at night to feed the very people he was supposed to be starving into submission. He eventually lifted the siege entirely in September 1590, declaring that he would rather not have Paris at all than rule over a giant graveyard. It is a rare moment of profound humanity cutting through the ruthless machinery of medieval warfare, proving that even a conquering king could be horrified by the results of Madame de Montpensier's deadly bread. Looking back at the horrific phenomenon of the bone bread, it is incredibly easy to dismiss the Parisians of 1590 as primitive, superstitious peasants driven mad by hunger. But that is a tremendous disservice to their ingenuity. We have to reframe what we are looking at. These people weren't acting out of sheer savagery. They were engaging in an extreme, desperate form of problem solving. In our modern world, a grocery store running out of bread is a minor inconvenience. But for them, the entire concept of agriculture had been violently stripped away. They looked at an utterly impossible situation: zero food, zero hope, and a hostile army at the gates, and they utilized the absolute only resource left available to them. They engineered a way to mill, process, and bake a completely new substance, turning the Cimetière des Saints Innocents into a macabre pantry. It was a catastrophic failure biologically, yes, but the sheer willpower required to dig up the earth, feel the cold grit of pulverized remains between their fingers, and attempt to sustain the living is a staggering testament to human resilience. They refused to simply lie down and die quietly. They fought for survival with a dark, terrifying creativity that pushes the absolute limits of human endurance. It proves that the drive to survive will always override even our deepest, most sacred cultural taboos. The Siege of Paris in 1590 remains one of the darkest chapters in European history. It stripped away the romanticized illusions of war, revealing the grotesque reality of what happens when the powerful play political chess with the lives of the poor. Madame de Montpensier's bread stands as a chilling monument to desperation, a dense, ashen loaf baked in the fires of religious extremism and paid for with the lives of thousands. The next time you walk through a supermarket aisle surrounded by an endless abundance of food, take a moment to appreciate the fragile systems that keep the nightmare of 1590 firmly in the past. If you found this journey into history's darkest corners fascinating, hit that subscribe button and join us as we unearth more of the past's most uncomfortable truths. I want to hear from you in the comments. What is the most extreme survival story you have ever heard? Until next time, remember that history isn't just a list of dates and kings. It is the raw, unfiltered story of what it takes to survive.